the SAS Delta Force, the SEALs, Mossad. Every special forces unit in the world, every single one, traces its operational doctrine back to a British organisation that most people have never heard of. It was called the Special Operations Executive. Churchill called it the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It invented modern covert operations. And the man who built Delta Force, he didn't just take inspiration from the British. He served with the SAS, went home to America, and spent 15 years trying to replicate what he'd seen. He said so himself, in writing. The CIA's predecessor agency wasn't independently invented either. It was designed by the British, trained by the British, built on a British blueprint. This isn't national pride. It's documented, provable, traceable history. And it starts with one of the darkest moments in modern warfare. June 1940. France has fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force has been pulled off the beaches at Dunkirk, minus virtually all its heavy equipment. The Wehrmacht is standing on the Channel coast. 21 miles from Dover, Britain has no ally on the European continent. The Soviet Union is bound to Germany by treaty. The United States is neutral. For the first time in modern history, a major power finds itself locked out of an entire continent, with no conventional way to strike back. So Britain invents an unconventional one. And it wasn't random. Britain was uniquely positioned to do this. The British Empire had been managing irregular warfare for over a century. Lawrence of Arabia showed during the Arab Revolt that a handful of trained advisors could organize indigenous forces into a guerrilla army capable of tying down a conventional power. Orde Wingate led irregular operations in Palestine and Ethiopia, training fighters in ambush tactics and aggressive small unit warfare. The British Indian Army had generations of frontier experience, where initiative and improvisation weren't doctrine, they were survival. What Britain lacked was a single organisation to weaponize all of that knowledge at scale. Fragments existed, Section D of MI6, a War Office research cell called MIR, some hastily assembled independent companies sent to Norway. But they were uncoordinated, underfunded, and hampered by bureaucratic infighting. Churchill wanted something bigger, something deliberate, something that would terrify the enemy in ways the regular military couldn't. On 22nd July 1940, the War Cabinet approved the creation of the Special Operations Executive. SOE was formed by merging those existing fragments, Section D, MIR, and a propaganda outfit called Electra House, into a single body under Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare. Dalton was a Labour politician, combative and relentless. Placing SOE under economic warfare rather than the War Office or MI6 was a deliberate choice. SOE's mission was the strategic disruption of the enemy's ability to wage war. Churchill's instruction to Dalton has become one of the most famous directives of the war. And now, set Europe ablaze. The intent was unambiguous. Britain was building an organisation whose sole purpose was sabotage, subversion, and the support of armed resistance in every country under Axis occupation. Nothing like it had ever existed in any nation's order of battle, and within 5 years it would become the template for every covert operations capability on Earth. By war's end, SOE had dispatched over 13,000 personnel into the field, running active operations across dozens of countries, from Western Europe to Southeast Asia. Its structure was built around geographic country sections. F section for France, separate sections for Poland, Czechoslovakia, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Greece, Yugoslavia. In the Far East, Force 136 covered Burma, Malaya, and the rest of Japanese-occupied Asia. But here's what made SOE genuinely revolutionary. Irregular warfare existed before it. Everyone knows that. What SOE did was industrialize it. Standardized training, standardized equipment, standardized methods. A command structure capable of coordinating operations across an entire continent. Lawrence of Arabia was a gifted individual improviser. SOE was a factory for covert warfare. That distinction is everything. The man who designed that factory was Colin McVean Gubbins, career soldier, served in Ireland during the War of Independence, in Russia, on the northwest frontier of India. Gubbins wasn't an improviser. He was a systematizer. Before the war even started, while serving with MIR, he authored 3 pamphlets that collectively constituted the first formal doctrinal manuals for modern guerrilla warfare. The Art of Guerrilla Warfare, The Partisan Leader's Handbook, and How to Use High Explosives. Printed in 1939. Written in precise, practical language for people with no military training who might find themselves behind enemy lines. He drew on British experience in Ireland, where the IRA had demonstrated the lethality of small unit guerrilla tactics against a conventional occupying force. He drew on frontier warfare across the empire. And he distilled a century of that imperial, irregular experience into doctrine. Clear, replicable, teachable doctrine. That doctrine became the operating system of SOE. Gubbins became its executive director in September 1943 with the rank of Major General, running the entire organisation through D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe. Lord Selborne had replaced Dalton as the responsible minister in February 1942, but Gubbins shaped the operational reality. His fingerprints are on every significant SOE innovation. The nickname Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare captured the establishment's horror at what SOE represented. MI6 saw them as dangerous amateurs whose noisy sabotage operations would compromise delicate intelligence networks. The War Office resented the diversion of resources. SOE's methods, assassination, arming civilians, encouraging revolt, were considered, quite literally, ungentlemanly. That was the point. The gentlemanly way of war had produced Dunkirk. So what exactly did SOE invent? Start with the training pipeline, by itself a revolution and the single most directly traceable ancestor of every Special Forces selection program in the modern world. 3 stages. Preliminary schools in English country houses assessed recruits for basic suitability, psychological fitness, language ability, personal resilience. Those who passed moved to paramilitary training in the Scottish Highlands, in the rugged country around Arisaig on the west coast. And Arisaig wasn't a course, it was an ordeal. Recruits arrived knowing nothing. Within weeks, they were learning demolitions, not theoretical lectures on explosives, but hands-on work with plastic explosive, detonators, time pencils, and incendiary devices. They practiced placing charges on railway lines, bridges, and industrial equipment in realistic conditions, often at night, often in driving rain. Weapons training covered every firearm they might encounter behind enemy lines. Not just British and American weapons, but German, Italian, and Czech ones too. Because a resistance fighter couldn't be choosy about what he picked up. Fieldcraft meant navigation, camouflage, stalking, and living off the land in some of the most unforgiving terrain in Britain. Speed marches across mountains, timed and punishing. Unarmed combat every single day. The physical toll was deliberate. SOE's training philosophy, radical for 1940, was that the training had to be harder than the operation. If an agent could survive Arisaig, they could survive occupied France. The washout rate was severe, and that was the point. Better to discover a man's limits in Scotland than in a Gestapo interrogation room. The final stage was the finishing school at Beaulieu in Hampshire, pronounced Bewley, where agents mastered clandestine tradecraft. Cover identities so detailed that agents would live under them for weeks before deployment, eating, sleeping, and socializing as their cover persona until it became reflexive. Surveillance and counter-surveillance, dead letter drops, cut-out communication systems, resistance to interrogation, evasion of enemy security services, assessment, paramilitary skills, clandestine tradecraft. 3 stages. That is the structural template for every special operations training program that exists today. The close quarters combat instruction has an extraordinarily direct lineage. William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes were former Shanghai municipal police officers who'd spent decades dealing with armed criminals and close-range violence in one of the most dangerous cities on Earth. Fairbairn synthesized that experience into a combat system, first called Defend You, then refined into SOE's close quarters combat curriculum. No martial arts philosophy, no sporting rules. Just the fastest ways to incapacitate or kill a human being at arm's length. They designed the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife, a slender, double-edged commando dagger that became the emblem of the commandos and remains one of the most recognized military blades in history. When the Americans entered the war, Fairbairn was sent to train OSS personnel. The combatives taught in every special forces unit in the world descend in a direct, unbroken line from what these 2 men developed for SOE in 1940. SOE also formalized techniques that remain the bedrock of clandestine operations worldwide. Cell structures for resistance networks, where each member knows only a handful of others, so one capture can't compromise the whole organization. Dead drops, cut-out intermediaries, one-time pads for encryption, coded BBC radio messages as signals to agents in the field, a seemingly innocuous phrase like "the carrots are cooked," triggering a sabotage operation hundreds of miles away. Lysander aircraft landing on improvised strips in occupied territory to insert and extract agents. The S-phone for direct agent-to-aircraft communication during resupply drops. And then there was the hardware. SOE's camouflage section, Station 15 at the thatched barn near Boreham Wood, was unlike anything any military had ever operated. It was an inventor's workshop crossed with a saboteur's wish list, and the things it produced were genuinely extraordinary. Explosives disguised as lumps of coal, designed to be slipped into enemy fuel supplies, where they detonate inside a locomotive firebox or a ship's boiler. Incendiary devices hidden in everyday objects. Miniaturized radios that allowed agents to transmit intelligence back to London from occupied territory. Forged identity documents of extraordinary quality. The concept behind Station 15, that a covert organization needs its own dedicated research and development wing, purpose-building equipment that doesn't exist anywhere else, was itself an innovation. What a later generation would call a Q branch. SOE invented that too. And then the most consequential innovation of all, the concept now called unconventional warfare in American doctrine. The deliberate training, arming and direction of indigenous forces to conduct guerrilla operations against an occupying power. SOE didn't merely send agents to spy, it built armies in Yugoslavia, in France, in Burma. A small number of highly trained personnel multiplying their effect by orders of magnitude through indigenous fighters. That is the foundational doctrine of US Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. SOE invented it. Running parallel to all of this, Churchill, in June 1940, directed the formation of a new raiding force drawn from volunteers across the army, the commandos. Their significance is enormous because they established a principle that was genuinely revolutionary at the time. Elite units should be built through rigorous voluntary selection, where soldiers earn the right to serve rather than being assigned. The Commando Basic Training Centre was established in 1942 at Achnacarry Castle near Spion Bridge in the Scottish Highlands. The course was deliberately brutal. Speed marches over mountainous terrain in full kit, river crossings and assault courses under live fire, instructors using live ammunition, a commando innovation that horrified conventional military thinking, amphibious landings from actual craft, demolitions, close quarters combat. Men died in training at Achnacarry. The Saint-Nazaire raid of 28 March 1942 proved the concept. Commandos rammed an obsolete destroyer packed with delayed action explosives into the only dry dock on the French Atlantic coast large enough to service the German battleship Tirpitz, then fought their way through the port. Of 611 men, 169 were killed, 215 captured. But the dock was destroyed and stayed out of action for the rest of the war. Small, highly trained forces achieving strategic objectives out of all proportion to their size. Not a sideshow. A proof of concept for an entirely new model of warfare. While SOE built networks and the commandos refined raiding, a 25-year-old Scots Guard subaltern named David Stirling was lying in a Cairo hospital bed in the summer of 1941. Back injury from a parachute accident, thinking about something fundamentally different. Stirling had served with No. 8 Commando in North Africa and considered the commando raids he'd seen to be wasteful. Too many men, too much overhead, too little return. His insight was simple but transformative. Very small teams of highly trained men, inserted behind enemy lines by parachute, vehicle or on foot, could attack high-value targets, particularly aircraft on Axis airfields, and withdraw before the enemy could respond. Tiny teams, maximum initiative, minimum supervision, strategic targets. Stirling wrote his concept in a memorandum, talked his way past a sentry into Middle East headquarters in Cairo, and delivered it to General Neil Ritchie, who brought it to Commander-in-Chief Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck approved it. In July 1941, L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade was formed. 6 officers, 60 men. The name was a deception, designed to make the enemy believe a large airborne force existed in North Africa. The first operation was a disaster. A parachute drop on November 16, 1941, scattered by high winds. Only 22 of 62 men made the rendezvous. Stirling didn't abandon the concept. He adapted it. Partnering with the Long-Range Desert Group for vehicle transport, the SAS switched tactics and began a devastating campaign against Axis airfields. In a single raid on Wadi Tamet on the 14th of December 1941, Paddy Mayne, Robert Blair Mayne, former Irish international rugby player and one of the most decorated British soldiers of the war, personally destroyed 24 aircraft on the ground. By the end of their first year, the SAS had destroyed more Axis aircraft in North Africa than the Royal Air Force had in the same theatre during the same period. The proof of concept was overwhelming. What the SAS added to the Special Forces template was fundamentally different from SOE. SOE was clandestine, agents undercover, building networks, conducting sabotage that appeared to be local resistance. The SAS was overt, direct action, uniformed soldiers conducting unmistakably military raids. Together, they represented the two halves of what modern doctrine calls special operations, covert action and direct action. Britain invented both, simultaneously, in the same war. Every modern special forces unit operates somewhere on the spectrum between those two poles, and both poles were defined in Britain. Now, the proof of doctrine. 3 operations that demonstrate SOE didn't just exist, it delivered results at the strategic level. Operation Anthropoid, 27th of May, 1942. Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, 2 Czechoslovak soldiers trained at SOE schools in Britain, had been parachuted into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia the previous December. They spent months building a local support network, conducting surveillance and preparing an ambush. When they finally struck, they hit SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich's open-topped Mercedes in a Prague suburb. Gabčík's Sten gun jammed. Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade. Heydrich died of septicemia on the 4th of June. The highest-ranking Nazi assassinated during the war. SOE had demonstrated it could project lethal force against a specific, named, strategically significant target, what modern doctrine calls targeted killing. Operation Gunnercide, night of 27th February 1943. Norwegian SOE trained commandos skied across the Hardangervidda Plateau in winter, one of the most inhospitable environments in Europe, frozen and wind-blasted, descended a gorge the Germans had considered impassable and left unguarded, entered the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant at Vemork through a cable duct, placed demolition charges on the electrolysis chambers producing deuterium oxide essential to the German nuclear program, and withdrew without firing a shot. Over 500 pounds of heavy water destroyed. The German nuclear effort set back by months. A handful of SOE-trained men neutralized a strategic weapons program that would otherwise have required a massive and costly bombing campaign. Precision, economy, strategic effect. That's the definition of special operations. And then D-Day. In the lead-up to June 6, 1944, SOE orchestrated arguably the largest coordinated sabotage campaign in the history of warfare. Plan Vert targeted railways. Plan Violet targeted telecommunications. Plan Tortue targeted roads. On the night of the invasion, SOE coordinated resistance groups executed hundreds of simultaneous attacks across France. Over 900 railway cuts in the first 24 hours. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, ordered from Toulouse to Normandy, a 3-day journey, took 17 days, harassed every step by resistance fighters armed, trained and coordinated through SOE networks. 17 days. A full-strength SS Panzer Division held in check by guerrillas with Sten guns and plastic explosive. That delay wasn't incidental to the success of the Normandy landings. It was instrumental. The Jedburgh teams were the mechanism that made all of this possible. 93 three-man teams, each composed of 1 American, 1 British and 1 French officer, parachuted into France from June 1944 onward. Their mission wasn't to fight alone. It was to find, organize, arm and direct local resistance groups, then coordinate their guerrilla operations in direct support of the conventional Allied advance. Small teams of trained professionals multiplying their combat power through indigenous fighters. That is the exact mission profile of US Army Special Forces today. It's what the Green Berets train for. It's what they did in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in a dozen other conflicts since. The Jedburgh teams did it first. SOE's reach went far beyond Europe. In Burma, Force 136, SOE's Far East arm, ran one of the most ambitious unconventional warfare campaigns of the entire war. British officers parachuted into the Burmese jungle to make contact with local resistance groups, arm them, train them, and direct their operations against the Japanese. They built guerrilla armies in terrain so dense and hostile that conventional forces could barely operate. These small SOE teams, often numbering fewer than a dozen men, coordinated thousands of indigenous fighters, conducting ambushes, sabotaging supply lines, and gathering intelligence critical to the conventional British advance. Force 136 demonstrated something important. SOE's model wasn't specific to Europe. It worked anywhere. The doctrine was universal: train, arm, direct local forces, and it could be exported to any theatre, any terrain, any culture. That universality is exactly what made it so easy for every other nation to adopt. Which brings us to the most provocative part of this argument: the American connection. In the summer of 1940, William Stevenson, a Canadian intelligence officer codenamed Intrepid, was appointed to head British security coordination in New York, operating from room 3603 in Rockefeller Center. His official mandate was to coordinate British intelligence in the Western Hemisphere. His real mission was to cultivate the American military and intelligence establishment and lay the groundwork for US entry into the war. His most consequential contact was William Wild Bill Donovan, Medal of Honor recipient, Wall Street lawyer, close associate of President Roosevelt. In July 1940, at Stevenson's invitation, Donovan traveled to Britain. He met senior intelligence officials. He was briefed extensively on SOE's operations and methods. He toured facilities. He came home convinced America needed its own coordinated intelligence and special operations organization, something the United States entirely lacked. Think about that for a second. In 1940, the most powerful industrial nation on Earth had no centralized intelligence agency, no covert operations capability, no special forces, nothing. In July 1941, Roosevelt appointed Donovan as Coordinator of Information. On the 13th of June, 1942, that office was reorganized as the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Here is the critical point. The OSS was not an independent American invention. It was modeled directly, explicitly, and provably on SOE, with British help, British training, and British blueprints. BSC didn't merely inspire the OSS. It drafted the memoranda that became the foundational planning documents for the American agency. When the OSS needed to train its first agents, it sent them to Camp X, an SOE facility on the shore of Lake Ontario, near Whitby, Ontario, established in December 1941. British-run, British-staffed. Teaching the full SOE syllabus: sabotage, clandestine communications, silent killing, demolitions, agent handling. Half of the initial contingent of OSS Detachment 101, the first American Special Operations Unit, which would go on to run guerrilla operations in Burma, was trained there by British SOE instructors. The OSS was dissolved on the 1st of October 1945. But the institutional knowledge didn't vanish. The CIA was created in 1947 under the National Security Act. OSS personnel became CIA officers. SOE-derived tradecraft and operational doctrine carried straight through into the CIA's Directorate of Operations, the covert action arm that would define American intelligence for the next 70 years. The world's most powerful intelligence agency's ability to conduct covert operations is a direct descendant of a British wartime organisation. SOE to OSS to CIA, an unbroken chain. But the military lineage is just as direct and just as documented. US Army Rangers, the first American soldiers trained at Achnacarry Castle by British commando instructors. They didn't adapt the program, they took the course. Same live fire exercises, same brutal pace, same standards. The Ranger ethos was forged in the Scottish Highlands under British supervision. Charles Alvin Beckwith. This is the single most important name in the lineage argument. A US Army officer who in 1962 was posted on exchange to the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment in Hereford, England. He spent a year training and operating with the SAS. The experience transformed him. He went home to America and spent the next 15 years arguing that the US military needed its own SAS equivalent unit. The bureaucratic resistance was enormous. In 1977, he finally got approval and stood up 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, Delta Force. He modelled it explicitly on the SAS. The selection process, the small team structure, the emphasis on individual initiative, the cross-training, the operational philosophy. He wrote about it openly and without ambiguity. Delta Force is a photocopy of the SAS. Beckwith said so. Israeli Special Forces? The lineage runs through Ord Wingate, the same British officer who pioneered irregular warfare in Ethiopia. Before the war, Wingate served in Palestine and formed the Special Night Squads, training a generation of Jewish fighters, including Moshe Dayan, in aggressive night operations, ambush tactics, and small unit initiative. Those fighters became some of the foundational military leaders of the new Israeli state after 1948. During the Second World War, members of the Jewish community in Palestine served in the British Army, and some were recruited by SOE for Balkan operations. The Palmach, the elite force of the Haganah, was established in 1941 with British cooperation. The IDF's emphasis on special operations, commando raids, intelligence-led targeting, and small elite units is a direct inheritance from British doctrine. The Australian SAS Regiment and the New Zealand SAS, directly patterned on 22 SAS using British doctrine, British selection models, British operational concepts. Not inspired by, modelled on. The Australian SASR was formally raised in 1957, explicitly following the British SAS template. Every single one of these connections is documented, named, dated, traceable. Not speculation, not inference, provable institutional genealogy. So here's what it comes down to. The SAS, Delta Force, the SEALs, Mossad, the Green Berets, Australian SAS, New Zealand SAS, the CIA's Covert Action Division. Every one of these organisations operates on a doctrinal foundation that was laid in Britain between 1940 and 1945 by three organisations: SOE, the SAS, and the Commandos. SOE invented covert operations as organised state doctrine. The SAS invented direct action special forces. The Commandos invented the selection-based training model that produces the operators. Together, they defined the entire spectrum of modern special operations warfare. Every time a special forces team anywhere in the world conducts a covert raid, runs an agent network, trains guerrilla fighters, or eliminates a high-value target, they're executing a playbook that was written in the Scottish Highlands, in the deserts of North Africa, in the country houses of wartime England, and in the jungles of Burma. The doctrine survived because it worked. And it worked because Britain, standing alone in 1940 with no way to fight a conventional war, invented an entirely new way of waging one. They called it ungentlemanly warfare. The rest of the world called it the future. If you got something out of this, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.